branch of cybernetics I'm interested in is defined by a worldview or ontology. It's a picture of the world as endlessly, open-endedly becoming in decentered, performative interaction.
Andrew, thank you so much for your generosity to join the conversation and to make time for this. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you? You look well too.
Yeah, I'm doing fine here. One of those rare sunny days in the Netherlands.
Right.
Where
Same
I'm
here.
based. Yeah, so it's always a kind of source of joy, especially, I myself, I come from Ecuador originally. So I celebrate every little bit of light that arrives here. As you know, I reach you because your work has been very inspiring to me and to the research that I'm conducting now. It always feels funny to use the word conducting because conducting research feels very serious. And as an artist, I feel always as an amateur. But so the research that I'm doing, let's say, in relation to my project that is trying to combine biological computers with the ethnographic work of Marisol+de+la+cadena regarding Earth beings. I'm also thinking on the work that is happening now in the field, in fields like neurobiology, plant intelligence, or biological mutualism. So the first question, I think, is just kind of like to create a common ground. What brought you to focus into these particular cyberneticians in the cybernetic brain? And I feel like especially towards Stafford and Gordon Pask.
Well, it was a funny kind of route for me. Years ago, I wrote this book called The Manual of Practice, which was about scientific research. What does scientific research look like? And I ended up with a couple of key concepts. One was kind of post-humanism, that in science, the scientists themselves are kind of reciprocally tangled up with a lively world. And the other was emergence, that meaning nobody knows where this process is going, right? It's always surprising. And I kind of generalized that, and I thought it wasn't about science in particular. That's how the world is. That's where I got this word ontology from, new ontology. So the idea is that we're carried along in the flow of becoming. We're not in control and we don't know where it's going. Of course, the scientists who I was studying deny that, right? They insist on producing knowledge of the world as if the world was fixed, knowable, predictable, etc. So then I started thinking, well, what if instead of denying it, you try to work constructively with this ontology of decentered becoming? And I looked around and I finally ended up discovering for myself cybernetics as a field that kind of acted in the presence of becoming. And, you know, it's very hard to find out about cybernetics, actually. You try reading what people have written about it, it's not very enlightening at all. So I went back to the beginning and I started reading the original work of the cyberneticians, you know, people like Norbert Wiener, Warren McCulloch, the Macy conferences. And I discovered that the people who I was really grabbed by, who kind of spoke to me, was this bunch of people who I finally realized they were actually English. They weren't British, they were English. I don't know why the English was so odd in this context, but so, you know, that in the first generation, there's Grey Walter, Ross Ashby, Gregory Bates, and I wrote a bit about him. And then in the second generation, the two obviously most interesting people were Stafford and Gordon Pask. And I set myself the project of trying to understand what on earth these guys were doing, because their work looks fascinating, but it also looks incredibly strange. And it took me an awfully long time, it almost has this almost magical quality to it. And, in the end, you have to get into a kind of different frame of mind. I used to be a physicist back in the old days, but you have to think differently to understand the cybernetician.
This might sound a bit silly, sorry, but
yeah.
did you, because just a second ago you were speaking about the coincidence that all these, or not, that all these cyberneticians in particular were British. Like, I was just wondering, like, did you ever consider exploring the connection between this British cybernetics and Monty Python?
No, I thought more about the connections to Doctor Who, actually.
Sorry, but I interrupted you just to make this silly joke.
Now you made me think about that. I used to love Monty Python, but it never struck me that was like British cybernetics.
It's just that some of the machines that were, and the interfaces and ideas, just seems like sometimes like things that could be taken from like something that's, and you mentioned this, the fact that the cybernetics practice by these thinkers, makers, by these cyberneticians in the end, it was strange, but also I read you saying that that they were both serious and also there was even a kind of sense of humor as well.
And that's why you think of Monty Python. I mean, it's kind of right, that, well, Monty Python was a 60s thing, it was partly at least what it's doing is making fun of the establishment, the different characters that John Cleese, makes fun of. They're all kind of members of the British establishment. And certainly, cybernetics was a non-establishment way of going on. In the end, Stafford Beer said the establishment beat us, In the 60s, things were more open and more possibilities. But then in the 70s, things started to go back to normal, which was bad news for cybernetics.
Like, you seem to have a certain level, let me say it's like suspicion, with like a fixation with epistemologies that seem to be very present in second order cybernetics, and BCL being part of it. I was just wondering, like, why the biological computer laboratory by heinz+von+foerster is, you didn't think it belonged to in this book?
I used to work at the University of Illinois, which is where the BCL was. My friend Peter Asaro wrote about some interesting stuff about the BCL. My book is 450 pages long, right? And the only thing that stopped it getting longer was that I decided just to focus on these 4 or 5 people. They did have connections to the BCL. I talked about those a bit, but somehow focusing on those guys didn't drag me in very much to the BCL. There was some very interesting stuff done there. Pask was there a lot, Ashby was there. I was less interested in the Ashby's work that he wrote about in what's it called, Introduction to Cybernetics, that kind of information theory line, which is what he concentrated on when he was in America. That didn't really speak to me, so I didn't write about it very much. Certainly, the BCL was one of the origins of second-order cybernetics. The second order really developed after the BCL finished, when von Foerster retired. And, I think I think they were doing a lot of interesting things at the BCL before it closed down. But after the laboratory and all the material side of American cybernetics kind of closed down, they move into this kind of epistemological second order cybernetics, which is true, also never really spoke to me. It, the wonders of cybernetics are somewhere else, as far as I'm concerned.
What is the sweet point for you, where you think, okay, here is really where the most revolutionary side, anti-establishment side of cybernetics is located, and why?
I'm interested in machines, actually. I like machines and gadgets and things like that. And the key machine for British cybernetics especially was this machine called a homeostat that Ross Ashby built in 1948. And the nice thing about the homeostat is that it kind of actively explores its environment and it reacts to what comes back from its environment by reconfiguring, its inner circuitry. And that model of, a system that explores other dynamical systems and reacts to it, for me, is the kind of version of cybernetic ontology or worldview that marks it off from other ways of understanding and acting in the world. So I was very interested in the different projects that the cyberneticians engaged in, how they, as it were, brought this ontology down to earth in psychiatry or robotics or spirituality or biological computing.
How do you define biological computing?
I mean, I think the thing to do is kind of take it literally, actually. A computer is a kind of input-output device. You might feed in numbers and then some other numbers come out, signals and instructions come out. And the question is what lies between the inputs and the outputs. So in my laptop, it's silicon chips that are doing the processing inside this machine. Biological computing means get rid of the digital electronics and stick in some kind of biological material. So in World War II, B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist, persuaded pigeons to peck at a screen where the target for a ballistic missile was, right? Mm-hmm. So these pigeons were the heart of the kind of little biological computer designed to aim missiles at enemy targets. Right? And I wrote about a guy called Garnet Hertz, who had a cockroach-controlled robot, and a cockroach would react to lights and steer the robot around. Those are biological computers for finding your way around in space. You could program a computer, my laptop, to do that kind of thing. But here pigeons or cockroaches were doing the processing. And then if you want to talk about the British cyberneticians, they weren't trying to build biological computers to find their way around in space. They were trying to build computers that would adapt to whatever the world would send them and act appropriate. So instead of having pigeons and cockroaches as the processor, they tried to use naturally occurring adaptive systems and somehow wire them into controlling a factory. That's what they were trying to do. And the adaptive system that I probably made famous is this pond, right?
Yes.
Beer would just get a bucket full of water out of a pond and try and, the problem was creating an interface to it. How would you send information into a pond? And how would you extract information from it? That was where they got stuck. Right? It was the interface, not the idea. The idea is so wild. it's a fabulous idea, but once you see it, it makes sense. You know, you can trace it back to Ashby and his homeostat. The homeostat was supposed to be a model of the adaptive brain. This little machine that he built in 1948 was supposed to be a very simple model of the brain. And once you start thinking a very simple electromechanical model, an electromechanical machine is a model of the brain, then you can say, well, you know, any adaptive system can be a brain in some sense. And the world is full of adaptive systems.
It's
I mean, you know this, don't you?
yes,
Right?
yes.
The implications of your own world.
Yeah, and actually, you know, one of the things that I'm well, just curious is like, well, I have to say that there is a certain romanticism that I feel or I discover in me when reading this type um, of experiments done, not because they were not fully serious and fully committed to attempting to succeed at what they were trying to do, but just because it is like a history, like somehow it is as if this kind of cybernetics that you're covering in the cybernetic brain, at least the ones referring to biological computing, which are really the wildest experiments that one can imagine. Um, the fact that they failed, they've been somewhat forgotten, and somehow it almost feels nowadays like there is no legacy for it, but the potential to create a legacy or a version of the 21st century. Like for instance, you know, one of the things that I've been considering is like, what would it be to attempt again to do some of these experiments by using some of the technologies that we have nowadays?
Mm.
Would that be then, like, is it like, do you think that they fail because the technology wasn't ready for it, the technological environment that they were, or is it something that is just way too complex to organize?
In many ways, we've got technology that could do things better that the cyberneticians wanted to do back then. So, you know, if you look at Stafford Beer's CyberSign project in Chile, you know, that was based in a control room which had fantastic information technology, or, you know, presenting live information about the Chilean economy to the people who sit in these controlling chairs. That was miles ahead of its day in the early 1970s. Today, you know, my laptop and your laptop you know, could do what CyberSign wanted to do, you know, so much better, right? In that sense. In the other sense, I mean, there are some attempts at kind of biological computing, if that's what you're really interested in.
Yes.
I mean, artists actually love working with biological materials. You know, I mentioned Garnet Hertz's cockroach control thing. I talked a bit about Eduardo Catch in my book. Slime molds are extremely interesting. Yeah. Adaptive systems. And, you know, there are famous experiments using slime molds to simulate the configuration of the Tokyo railway system and things like that, or solve simultaneous equations. There's a bit of that. I mean, the problem will be to get somebody to take it seriously. No, I think there are. You know, I'm not really an expert on this, but there are probably quite a few people these days who are interested in alternative ways of computing rather than just kind of programming silicon chips.
There are emerging technologies that you would think would lead us in that direction, but somehow they're constantly steered towards more normative uses. Like I'm thinking now of DNA storage, for instance. So you would think, okay, here's the potential for considering, although it's only the storage, it's not the processing of the data in itself. But you would think, okay, here's some potential, but somehow it seems like there is certain corporative like way of thinking that leads people to immediately discover something that has a wide potential and put it into some kind of like normative use. This is something that I've been thinking, and also let me comment something here, which is a possibility that has come to my mind from reading your papers and your book as well, has been one of the more radical ideas I feel are put forward in your the cybernetic brain. If in general, cybernetics needed a predefined objective in order to steer towards that objective, towards that purpose or goal, you ask, what would it be for a system not to have predefined goals?
Well, I mean, if you think about the music color machine, the thing for turning a musical performance into a light show, and what the lights are doing is coupled in some mysterious and adaptive way to the music. Right? You can mess around with a machine like that. I don't think you know what the target was, except that you're trying to find something you like. It's a bit like playing somebody at chess, or I think about playing squash. So I know those are games that have got no result, but the actual process of playing. How am I going to play you at chess? What's it like playing you at chess? How would we have fun? You don't know in advance. You'd have to find out. And I think that's Beer's idea, was that with a viable system, you don't really know what you're aiming for. It certainly wasn't the maximization of profits, for example. What's the kind of harmonious, adaptive way of working with, the universe of the firm? It's got something to do with economics and money and materials and stuff. But I think a viable system would be kind of happily playing squash against its, environment without having a definition of what happily playing squash is. It's a bit vague, isn't it?
Yeah. In that sense, like in the case of the music color device by Gordon Pask, so the issue of adaptability is key, right? The fact that the coding or the programming is not only translating a chord into a color, but the fact that actually if the musician doesn't keep on generating some sort of like variations, then the system will collapse basically, or stop working, or and this idea of adaptability seems to be the clue here, right? Also with the VSM, the fact that adaptability seems to be even more important than the goals. So, sort of the goal is to keep the elements in the system engaged.
Of course, Beer himself had a very simple answer. The aim of an adaptive system is to stay alive, right? That's why he called his model of an organization the viable system model. A viable system is one that stays alive as everything around it is fluctuating, which is, you know, but if staying alive doesn't mean staying the same. You know, Beer would say staying the same is the recipe for death. So you have to be able to become something new as your environment changes. And so it's that kind of organic viability, which is the criterion and the aim, the object of, you know, the viable system model and maybe any other cybernetic project you can think of. You know, I mean, you just described the, you know, a musicolor performance is trying to keep the musicolor machine involved and trying to keep it alive and acting with you. This kind of, and you know, I think I saw, yeah, you use this phrase "earth beings" or something like that.
Yes.
That's a way of thinking about, you know, living in a lively world and trying to get along with it. So that getting along is the criterion. You know, I sent you a chapter out of a book that I'm trying to write at the moment. And the title of the book at the moment is something like Closer to Nature. And the subtitle is Doing Without Science. So, you know, a kind of scientific way of being in the world, a modern way of being in the world, has to do with distancing ourselves from it so that we can control it. We're always trying to achieve a kind of dualist mastery. And you can say, you know, what aspect of the world is it we're trying to master? You know, it might be the Mississippi River. We're trying to stop the Mississippi River flowing. We want to pin it down in place. That's a well-defined objective. And I am interested in different ways of going on. And you know, the phrase might be something like closer to nature, paying attention to what nature is doing and reacting to that and seeing what comes back to us.
So you are taking on, of course, a very complex challenge here, right? Because to, let's say, somehow coupling the non-modern with the modern seems to be something incredibly difficult, and at the same time it feels nowadays as if the very survival of humanity depends on incorporating what is non-modern, like, for instance, different relationships with nature. The fact that if we keep on relating to nature in the modern way, doesn't seem like we are viable for the future for too long. Could you tell us a little bit about the tensions, let's say, between this coupling that you're trying to do between science, cybernetics, and animism, or is it that you're walking away from science in this specific case, or are you trying to coupling it somehow with let's say animistic ideas?
No, I mean,
shamanistic.
You know, yeah, I mean, deep down, I'm a kind of dichotomous thinker. I don't feel like I'm writing about coupling the modern and the non-modern. What I always find myself saying is that these are two different paradigms, the way Thomas Kuhn used to talk about it. They're different ways of understanding the world, and they're different patterns of action that go with those ways of understanding. So if, you know, the physics that I learned when I was a schoolboy, if we're going to call that modern, then cybernetics, as I said probably 95 times in my book, is non-modern, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't respect the kind of dualism of people and things which characterizes modernity. It doesn't think that the world is knowable. It's got nothing to do with rationality. What fascinates me is But you can have this non-modern paradigm and still act in the world. You know, the cyberneticians did real things. You know, psychiatry, the arts, robotics. There are these kind of non-modern cybernetic versions of all of these things. So the subtitle of this book that I'm writing now is Doing Without Science. I am talking about ways of actually engaging with the environment and nature that don't involve, you know, going through this detour through science to understand the inner workings. I'm interested in other ways that somehow involve getting closer to nature and responding to it. You know, so I've written about adaptive management of the Colorado River. You know, how can we restore the ecosystem of the Colorado below the Glen Canyon Dam, right? That's the Grand Canyon. And you could try and calculate what you need to do to upgrade this ecosystem. Or you could kind of stage experimental floods through the dam and see how the ecosystem responds. You could stage a dance of agency between the water flow and the ecosystem, the plants and the fish and the animals, and see what happens, right? That is, you know, my phrase is doing without science. It's a way of acting. It's a way of finding out. It's also a way of restoring, to a certain extent, the ecosystem, which doesn't involve any cognitive understanding at all, right? It's like beer. He said, you know, this state of play is, I wake up in the middle of the night and I mess around with this tank full of pond water. And then he said, sometimes I try and understand it. I know I shouldn't understand. You know, it's this kind of non-cognitive way of being attuned to nature and the world.
So it seems then that up to a high degree, this is more of an attitude towards life and as a way of engaging with reality. These very complex management problems that you just mentioned with the Mississippi River, or the Colorado River, sorry, Colorado River. Like the fact that it is really the approach what changes. Like it seems like if we would have at our disposal the most sophisticated AI, there wouldn't be any room for it to participate in this approach. Or would you say that somehow this approach, that there is room for emerging technologies like AI to participate in this type of adaptive ontology?
You know, I mean, I can see how things get along without AI. I'm not sure that AI would improve things or speed them up. Another chapter in my book is about so-called natural farming, developed by a guy in Japan called Masanobu Fukuoka. And he had a very productive way of farming, which he developed over a long period, which didn't involve plowing the land. It didn't involve fertilizers or pesticides. He was actually trying to do as little as possible. And he discovered that by doing as little as possible, he could grow as much rice as, you know, the usual techno-scientific farming. And he was very clear that science just got in the way. And I could give you other examples. So, you know, science makes things seem, you know, impossibly complicated. Whereas just staging this kind of simple dance of agents, trying this, seeing what happens, trying that, is a very simple and direct way of, you know, developing this productive way of farming, managing the ecosystem of the Colorado River. You know, it seems to me to be a very different paradigm.
Is there a role for cybernetics in these projects that you're mentioning, or is it not even necessary?
For me, cybernetics the branch of cybernetics I'm interested in is defined by a worldview or ontology. It's a picture of the world as endlessly, open-endedly becoming in decentered, performative interaction. Along with that, I would like to think, go certain ways of acting in the world, right? So if you think you're in command of the world, you'd act like the Army Corps of Engineers and try and dominate the Mississippi River. If you realize that you're in a world that you don't control, that's always going to surprise you, you'd act like these dam operators that are staging experimental floods on the Colorado to try and find out what the Colorado wants to do, to cooperate with the river rather than dominating it. Do you have to be a you have to call yourself a cybernetician to develop these ways of acting with nature rather than acting on nature? No, you don't. It doesn't bother me that these projects I'm writing about now generally don't call themselves cybernetic. I can understand them better because of the trip that I've been on through cybernetic. But I think, you know, there is this enormous paradigm full of all sorts of projects of getting on with nature, getting closer to the world, which are non-modern projects, which look very different from their modern equivalent.
I'm really intrigued by what you're saying, because, you know, nowadays, when I think about what many people consider to be revolutionary, is something that may sound like this. So, for instance, you know, with the big boom of cryptocurrencies and blockchain technologies and so on and so forth, one of the main concerns is the energy consumption of those technologies. Then it seems like what we are thinking to do is just to tamper the problem by trying to find renewable sources to take care, to provide the energy required by it. But I feel like you're doing something which is much more deeply than just finding the least damaging source to keep up with our technological development. But it seems like you're speaking about something which is like way at the foundation of it. Like perhaps you can just get away with many of these gadgets because they are perhaps not as useful as we think. I wonder if you could comment on this idea of questioning the very foundations of modern technology.
Yeah, very good. I mean, you've got the hang of what I'm trying to do. I keep trying to write that out in the first chapter of this book that I'm working on, how to say it. I mean, one thing to say is, I think we're in a mess, right? I think, all these things that get called the Anthropocene, all these disasters are happening around us, especially global warming, things like that. It might be that the only way, to stop global warming, something has to be done rather quickly. The answer might be nuclear power everywhere and, injecting aerosols into the atmosphere to reflect the sunlight. I don't know. I mean, I'm not in that business. I've got no idea of any short-term fixes for the world's problem. But at the same time, these short-term fixes, I just have this image of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic as it's going to go down, so we'll have solar power instead of coal power or nuclear. They're all in the same space, right? They're just kind of variations on the theme of what I call enframing, domination. And what I'm writing about, what I've been writing about ever since that cybernetics book, is actually different ways of acting that aren't rearranging the deck chairs on the deck of the Titanic. Systematically different ways of behaving in the world that don't seem to me to bring all these dangers that we know so well along with them for different reasons. You have to think that out. And positively might actually be fun, like cybernetics. They're much more graceful, right? There's nothing, graceful, stylish, cool. Wouldn't it be nice if we could live on the surface of the planet gracefully? It's not just to avoid the danger, but the opposite of grace is oafish. I think, our standard ways of behaving in modernity are oafish, clumsy, ugly, graceless. So yeah, I'm trying to find, if we had all the time in the world, we could move gracefully into these other ways of practicing being alive. That's the politics of my project, to try and show we have a choice in our pattern ways of being alive. Yeah.
The way I see this is that it seems like with modernity, because of its wonderful efficiency or apparent efficiency, we experience suddenly all these financial booms and technological booms, and it's of course the question of humbling ourselves in order to save ourselves seems very difficult at this point, after having learned so deeply at such emotional level that the best way forward was to do more engineering, right? Like if a problem didn't have a solution, was because the engineers haven't yet found a solution. So nowadays we're speaking about geoengineering, for instance, right? This type of thing that you were mentioning before. It seems like in the path, in that the so-called path forward of modernity, like big shadows were cast side on side, and so many other paradigms were made invisible, or according to that modern paradigm, rendered useless or just cultural. That was a nice way of calling it. That's something that Marisol+de+la+cadena has also spoken about, how the nice way for politicians, for instance, in Peru, to deal with indigenous peoples who speak about earth beings when they speak about the rights of nature, is to call it simply cultural beliefs. So it seems like modernity has cast all these shadows, and I don't know how you feel about it, but I mean, I feel like in a way, well, I'm just trying to explain myself with my own clumsy metaphors, but it feels like this is a moment when we could do an archaeology of those shadows, which are alive. It's not just the past, it's an archaeology of the present in a way. For instance, when we speak about indigenous epistemologies, it's really not something that happened back in the day, right? These are communities that are alive and making their own ways of worlding. It just seems like, I don't know if you share this feeling that somehow it's in the shadows of modernity where some solutions are to be found.
Oh yeah, no, that's already in the book, actually. I mean, there are two things going on here, right? Modernity is an amazing achievement. I actually talk about islands of stability, finding these islands where we are more or less in control is an incredibly impressive achievement. It's awesome. But what we're starting to realize now, or I hope we are, is that there's a kind of dark side. You're talking about shadow. I think about the dark side of modernity, that tied to the incredible achievements of modernity are all these disasters and catastrophes and the extinction of species and global warming. And we still tend to think about those as being kind of unfortunate accidents, as though, you know, they shouldn't have happened. They won't happen again in the future. And the way I see it, the way I understand things now, is that the dark side is part of, you know, the positive achievements of modernity. You can't have one without the other, which is a good reason to try and think of other ways to be, to get away from the dark side. And, you know, what I actually been writing in my book is that I discuss various examples of other ways to go on. And they all seem to involve going back in history, kind of rewinding history and coming out as a different direction. As if, you know, we took this modern path 200 years ago or 5,000 years ago in World War II. And it hasn't worked out so great. What if we went back 500 years and took a different direction? That's, yeah, I mean, where else are we going to look? I mean, that's the funny thing, you know, if you want to find some inspiration for acting differently from our dominant ways, well, you can look in the margins at what is done now, right? So, you know, Peruvians who go on about earth beings are there still, right? But, you know, that's, yeah, I mean, people say science transcended, you know, these superstitions. But maybe it would be instructive to go back and think about these superstitions and try and make them work. You know, that would be very interesting. One thing about the superstition is that they warn you that, you know, the world is full of powers that we don't control, which would be a very good way of thinking about modern technology. You know, think about a nuclear power station as being like a bad-tempered god, right? You have to be nice to it and try and keep it happy, but recognize that it's going to, you know, it could melt down tomorrow and there's nothing you can do about it. So that's the way this kind of traditional worldviews, animism, actually have a clearer image of what it's like to be in the world and the dangers that are part of that than modern science and engineering has.
There is an interesting dance, it seems to be done, and I wonder how are you doing it, and if so, when criticizing modern science, in a moment when very fanatical tribes are actually questioning modern science. Like, you know, extreme right or fundamentalist movements who are also questioning modern science, but for different reasons than the ones that you are criticizing it for. Like, how do you deal with this unfortunate possibility of being aligned with people that you might disagree with?
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, I've never thought about it. I thought a lot about what the world is like and how one should act in it. I'm quite willing to stick up for what I'm saying. It doesn't mean I have to agree with everybody else who says something that sounds a bit similar.
Yes.
It doesn't actually seem to be a big danger at the moment. So, yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, you know, I used to write about the history of particle physics. That's what my first book was about. And I was trying to say that, you know, the knowledge that physicists produce is in some sense constructive. It's not just given to them by God or anything like that. And the physicists used to say to me, well, you know, does that mean you believe in witchcraft? Very strange kind of way of thinking, but that's the way they would speak. You know, these days I feel like saying, well, yeah, I can think of a way to believe in witchcraft and spirits and things like that. I actually find it quite interesting.
I think it's in your text about ontologies, and it's like where you say that, or you place the question for what kind of world is that can accommodate all these different ontologies.
Oh, right, yeah.
And I think yeah, it just came to my mind now listening to you with these reflections. Actually, Andrew, there are two questions here for you from our colleagues. One is from Viveke, who is my partner, so I'm going to turn off my microphone so we don't have a return. And after that, Sebastian will ask a question.
Hello,
Okay. Hello.
Andrew. It's been such a joy to listen in on your conversation from the other side of the room, and also especially because your book and your line of thoughts have been so present in many conversations I've been having with Oscar over the last months, and seeing or hearing this conversation now and seeing you also in the space that you're in, I cannot help but notice that you have a bunch of Buddhist depictions, visuals, and I was very curious if you can say something about your idea or your consideration of cybernetics as part of a spiritual understanding of the world.
All right, that's a nice, simple question, isn't it?
For a change.
Yeah, I've always been very drawn to the kind of Buddhist aesthetic. I mean, there's a calendar there, and what do you call it there, behind me. Actually, in those kinds of terms, what I'm most drawn to is Taoism, and Chinese philosophy. You know, it seems to me that Taoism has got, you know, just the right picture of the world as unknowable. The important thing isn't to know it; it's how you get along with it. You know, the Zen master is somebody who kind of reacts with grace, whatever happens around him or her. You know, I like that idea. I don't claim to be a Zen master or always to act with grace or anything like that, but the Tao is the thing to think about. I actually got a bit fed up with Buddhism because Buddhism seems to be obsessed with the mind and cognition. You know. Of course, it says that we're mistaken, and you know, the mind is an illusion, and the world is an illusion created by the mind, which is probably true. But I mean, Buddhism always seems such a negative kind of philosophy in that angle. I don't know. I mean, you know, if I tried to think about cybernetics and spirituality, I'd have to think about Stafford, right, who taught tantric yoga in his later years. You know, he was very kind of Eastern. I mean, the interesting one very interesting idea he had is that, you know, in meditation, as a kind of technology of the self, he could actually experience the world as being, you know, different from our everyday world. You know, he would report on the state of his chakras and how they were spinning, and maybe wobbling a bit and things like that.
Mhm.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's not, and I mean, I feel that you have mentioned also in between the lines of these conversations, you know, when you say practicing being alive, that for me, that it's something that can be seen under such, or in relation to such spiritual understanding of the world also. And for me, I can see how it would relate to elements of Taoism. But thank you for responding, and I really look forward to your next book.
Okay, thank you.
And finally, we have a question from Sebastian.
Hey, hi, Andrew.
Hi.
And hi, Oscar. To give you a bit of context, I'm a research assistant of Oscar. So I was really pleased and I'm really happy to be able to join this conversation this afternoon. I mean, to listen, really interesting. And I had a question, maybe it's a bit, because it's the last question, I'm gonna open it up a little bit as well. My question is about, I have a feeling, it's very personal point of view, that the issue that we have right now is like, we always think that human can find solutions to all problems. We talk about it earlier, you talk about it a little bit earlier. And I also see that this is changing right now. For example, if you think about land restoration, which is a common practice in many parts of the world, for many years, we think we as humans have to intervene. And the more and more they started to realize that actually, if something disappears, it's not necessarily bad, because something else gonna come up and just rebalance the entire ecosystem. And so you can feel in certain, I would say in like biology or like this kind of field is pretty well accepted, but not at all in the world of computers and new technology. And in your opinion, what does it take to open this conversation in those different realms, let's say?
Right. I mean, I've written a little chapter about the history of water in Holland and different ways of dealing with it. So the Dutch have always been the masters of dominating water, building dikes, windmills, pumping water. And now they're the leaders in a different paradigm. You know, there's a project called Room for the River. I don't know if people talk about that in Holland, dismantling the dikes by the Rhine River, just letting it flood so that nature can absorb floods and you won't have, you know, rewilding. You know, Holland is the center for that. So I believe there's been a kind of paradigm shift in water engineering, perhaps especially in the Netherlands. What did it take to achieve that paradigm shift? A load of floods, a lot of people dying. You know, the conviction that that's not the way to save Holland disappearing under the sea, the need to try something else. I think a lot of people around the world are realizing that now. You know, it's no good building hard defenses around entire coastlines because the water's just going up and up. We've got to find some other way of relating to water. So what did it take to achieve this paradigm shift? You know, mega disasters and the prospect of even bigger disasters. That's a good way to change people's minds. Computing seems to be very successful, right? There aren't any equivalent disasters associated with it at the moment, I don't think. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. But, you know, I mean, it's got all the forces of modern capital behind it. Think about AI and it's Google and Facebook and all of these people. That bit of the modern paradigm is incredibly successful. I can't think how how to block it, all I can think of is just showing people other ways to go on and trying to recommend these other ways. You know, they're fun, they act in a different way. Very often they're cheap and imaginative and stylish. And you can criticize, you know, the whole computing AI vision of what intelligence is, you know. It's a very narrow definition of humanity. So you can try and criticize modern projects. You can, and probably the most effective way is to show other ways of going on. But it's not guaranteed to produce a lot of leverage, I'm afraid. Maybe you've got some ideas, maybe you can.
Well, I do think like work that, for instance, Oscar is trying to also achieve as an artist is also about this. It's also about bringing two different perspective in conversation, and then to open up a conversation. So
you mentioned something about how is it that natural disasters are really a way in which throughout history people have changed their minds, and unfortunately it's going to remain a way for us to keep on learning. I'm also thinking that there are moments when technologies hit a dead end. It just seems like in many ways we are hitting dead ends with some of these technologies, but it just takes long for us to understand that we are not moving forward with something, because the illusion of moving forward with modern technologies remains for longer than the actual development, it seems. And with AI, you know, I think it's a field that was stuck at some point. Then it re-emerged like over a decade ago, and again, it feels like, at least in some regards, it's hitting some dead ends as well with neural networks and so on. At least in terms of the most ambitious aims of AI, like obtaining or achieving some kind of general intelligence. Like it doesn't seem like there is any indication that that is anywhere near.
Right. You know, that's another version of the problem of consciousness, I think, which philosophers have been worrying about for the last 2,000 years without getting anywhere. It hasn't stopped them going on about it, right? Hasn't brought philosophy to an end. One thing we haven't talked about is your work and what you're doing with all this stuff.
Yeah, well, you know, for me, it's all uncertainty at this point, because at least with this project that I have mentioned, the one that is related to your work and marisol+de+la+cadena, and I'm in a moment of even trying to understand the question myself. What is the question? Because I understand it's more of a feeling at this point, a feeling of a relationship that is there between these different ontologies. And as an artist, you know, I'm always I'm so fascinated by experiments like those of the biological, related to biological computing, because I feel very moved by action. I feel very moved by trying to generate some kind of physical outcome from the research that I'm doing, to do physical experiments with it and to learn from them. It's extremely important for me as an artist. And I've been wondering, like, if I would be to propose some actual experiments of these relationships between biological computing, earth beings, and biological mutualism or plant intelligence, what would it be? And I have to say that my initial thought is one that I've been doubting, and after the conversation with you, I'm doubting it even further, which could be a good thing. So let me just tell you that my premise so far has been to like trying to couple an AI system of some nature or some kind within a natural environment, within an ecology, or an ecosystem rather, and to try to make it a participant. So it's inspired, but at the same time it's different than the biological computing experiments by Bill, for instance, in which what I thought is it would be interesting if this AI system, all it try to do is to adapt to this to the environment without trying to relate to it in a hierarchical way. But if you ask me, what do I mean by that? I'm not even sure myself. So I'm asking others who may know or have some thoughts about it.
Do you know an artist called Andy Gracie?
I don't.
English
So
guy.
I will look this artist up.
Yeah, there's Gracie, Gracie, and he did some work along those lines. I don't know, maybe 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And the funny thing was, when I spoke to him, he seemed to have lost interest in it. He wasn't doing it anymore, which seemed like a big shame to me. I was hoping he was going to tell me interesting things. But yeah, to have a couple of digital systems. Well, there are a lot of people working on artworks involving plants and things like that, aren't there, these days? Trying to communicate with them in some sense.
Yes, and I have to say that at the same time, I have to say that I'm not much interested in communication in a way. I'm interested, and this is something that I got really from your writings, the idea of adaptability. Somehow there is an issue with, well, depends of course what we mean by communication, and I myself will have to really explore what do I mean by that. But let me just take it for face value, and it's like there are, for instance, experiments of people using AI to try to communicate ways, to try to generate ways of communicating with whales. And to translate whale sounds into human language. And somehow for me, that feels like, like I'm not interested in that kind of communication. It just seems like it's, perhaps it succeeds. I do not know. Perhaps they succeed and they manage to do it. But somehow I feel like we are somehow narrowing everything, like very complex phenomena, in order to fit our paradigms.
Yeah. I mean, kind of linguistic communication. Right?
Yeah, in this case, linguistic communication.
Hoping the whales will speak to you or something.
Yeah, and then so the idea of adaptability, at least, although in a way is a way of communication, this kind of nonverbal way of communication.
Yeah. I mean,
it's something that I'm very fascinated with. But also, like there is a field of data translation. And already Gordon Pask was a step ahead of it by saying, oh, I'm not only going to translate these chords into this color, but I'm going to mess things up so that the adaptability issue is more prominent than the translation somehow.
Yeah, right.
And that's something that for me is very interesting, because also with experiments that I've seen of people working with plants, and for instance, picking electrical signs from the plants and translating them into something else. For me, this is a question that Pask already addressed, and he thought that wasn't interesting enough, because the question of adaptability is more interesting.
Yeah.
So, and that's something that I'm intrigued about, like how a system like, but again, this was like the previous premise was, or or the current, I do not know, premise has been like how an AI can adapt, but without, trying to instrumentalize the environment or just to translate it into some kind of one-to-one data translation way. But I'm thinking after this conversation with you, that perhaps the question is somewhere else. Perhaps the question is it's not about getting an AI system to communicate with an ecosystem, but perhaps I'm, you know what I'm considering after this conversation with you, that perhaps I should ask myself, what is it to dance with nature in the way you meant, before I place any experiment on it.
Good. Well, tell me where you get to. What do you find out?
Andrew, thanks again for the wonderful conversation.
All right.
Enjoy the rest of the day, and looking forward to read your book.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's keep in touch.
Let's be in
Bye-bye.
touch. Bye.